It's the type of job that you wouldn't do unless you got strong convictions. It's a bit of a thankless task.
We're talking to Michael Wrathall, the Senior Water Advisor to the Minister of Environment and Water, past SES officer in the Department of Agriculture with Wetlands Policy and Northern Water Use, and been a long-time friend of mine, and we're talking now about some ideas that we think might help the world. Thank you so much for coming on, Michael.
It's great to be with you, James.
I'm really keen to gather some information from you around what do you think would make the relationship between the department and the minister's office in general flow smoother?
I'll give you a bit of my perspective. I've been in the public service for 15 years or so, and I've been in the Minister's office now for a year. There's a few things I've noticed in the year I've been with the Minister's office that I think can really work. So one is really around aligning values. I can see where there's a real disconnect in values between those in the public service and those in the Minister's office. It can really cause a lot of friction. I've seen it's a very, very difficult dynamic. That's one thing. I guess it's difficult for those who've got personally strong values that are disconnected from those politically, but I think that's part of the challenge of being a public servant. One of the things is really around respecting the value of what each provides, because I think the Minister's office and the public service have different roles, and it's easier to sort of look at it from either side and go, that's not worthy, or point holes at a thing, but I think there are different roles. So I take on quite a different role in the Minister's office compared to a role I play in the public service, and it's not that it's necessarily better or worse, it is just different, and I think having that respect for that difference and not sort of belittling or poking holes at things, I think is really important, and that can happen at either side. So that respectful relationship between the two is critical, I've found. And the third thing I was just going to say was around setting the conversation at the right level. So looking at outcomes rather than diving into the process or details, and playing to your strengths. Part of the role of public service is really going, how do we do the nuts and bolts of implementing this thing? If you've got an advisor like me trying to go into the nitty gritty of what's really the department's role, that's not really helpful at all, can undermine the role of public service. And equally, if you've got the public service trying to get into the role of the Minister's office and trying to shift the policy direction of the government in a way that's not consistent with where the government's going or where the minister wants to go, then that's not helpful either. So I think it's understanding those roles and pitching at the right level and playing to the strengths of where your roles really are.
What's some advice from you on how I, as a public servant, can build rapport with my minister's office?
On one level, it's just simple human relationships. We're all people. Sometimes, ministers and ministers' offices in the public service can be held up on a pedestal and think that they're quite different in a lot of ways, but actually we're just people like people in the public service. And so I think just relating to people on a human level, I think is really critical. But having said that, ministers' offices are busy places, and the amount of time that you've got to deal with a particular issue that maybe in the public service you think is really important, and it's really important that I communicate these details to the minister's office. That's not the reality for advisors like me. We can't get into the detail, even though many times I would like to. So I think respecting people's time, but also building genuine human relationships there too, which is a real challenge. It is tricky.
Yeah.
An advantage that I had coming from the public service, I had already developed many of those relationships. So the colleagues I'm working with now, I already have that level of trust and have that relationship developed, which I think has made it much easier for me. I think for those who don't have that already, it is much harder given the nature of the time pressures, and given that you don't have that history, and perhaps even at times not an understanding of how the public service is if you've not worked in it. So I think being able to understand those two worlds absolutely helps. I've seen certainly advisors who haven't worked in the public service and don't understand their role and how public servants think. You can get that disconnect, and it does make a strain in the relationship, and it makes it harder.
That whole concept around connection and understanding where the other person's context is just so critical. I know that when I've been advising and teaching SES in the past, there's two resources that I use and refer back to help that were just brilliant and eloquent. One of them is a book by Ann Tiernan and Patrick Weller on learning to be a minister, Heroic Expectations and Practical Realities, which is a really great book at life and content in the minister's office. And the other one is No Minister, So You Want to Be a Chief of Staff by Alan Bean. Both of them really good resources for SES who use information through reading. Main point being, connection between just builds an easier collaboration. Michael, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the insights you've got and your willingness to share them, and just the work that you're doing. It makes for a better Australia, and I appreciate that you're there doing your passion.
Thank you, James. I love your show as well. I love what you're doing here too. It's an inspiration to many of us. So keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks so much. All right. Bye-bye now.
All right. See you, James.
Yeah, that's true. You work crazy hours, and you wouldn't do that unless you actually care.
Yeah.
That's the piece.
Yes.